Good evening, everyone. We're going to try and get started at 7 o'clock. I want to first give you some information because things are a little different tonight. In case you're wondering, I'm not Mava. Mava Solis, the president of the Lane County Audubon Society, is home very well and healthy, but with about 5 inches of snow. She lives way in the South Hills and is unable to get into town for this event. Same thing with Debbie Schlenoff, who is our Zoom guru who makes everything work. She's also up in the South Hills and waving to us. Maybe I can't see her, but we also wish that she were here. And so I'm here. And one else that's a little different is Joe, our speaker for tonight, was exposed to someone who eventually got COVID about a week ago. Joe tested negative, but he's going to wear a mask when he's around people and stuff like that. So, but he'll take it off for his talk tonight. Okay, yes. All right, so get those things out of the way. Takes a lot of people to put these, not these programs together so much, but the Audubon Society and people like Mava and her husband Dick, who's usually here helping getting all the chairs set up. He's not here also. Debbie, I already mentioned, who's the conservation person and tells us all about how to save our wildlands for people as well as animals and birds. And then we have Yaron Rentschler, who's back here. He's the treasurer. You never hear about him, but he's very important. He takes care of all the money. He knows how much we have and how much we're spending and all that kind of stuff. He's just fantastic. We have a bunch of other people that do things that make the whole thing work. And Mava puts it all together. She's kind of the ringleader. So I'm here by myself tonight, but we'll carry on. So I want to tell you a little bit about next month. We're going to have Magnus Herzmark, who gave a talk last year about his trip to southern Ecuador. And he's amazing, great photographer, great storyteller, just puts together a really interesting program. He has a pretty good subject matter to work with next month too. He and his wife, Rosie Hammond, went to Antarctica. So we're gonna go to Antarctica with Magnus next month. He also stopped in at South Georgia Island and the Falkland Islands. It should be fantastic, not just birds, mammals, all kinds of amazing things. So next month, March 28th, right here, come on back. Well, tonight we're really fortunate to have Joe Moll with us, the executive director of the McKenzie River Trust. It's an organization that I have been associated with because I've been associated with all kinds of people who are board members of McKenzie River Trust and presidents of McKenzie River Trust. And so I got dragged into McKenzie River Trust, not entirely unwilling. But we've been doing a lot of things out there and I've really enjoyed that involvement. And Joe gave us 2 talks earlier. He talked about the McKenzie River and just how it all works and things like that in the Finn Rock Reach area in particular. And then he also did a talk for us about the bears of Hokkaido, Japan. Remember that. Joe just does all kinds of stuff. He's just an amazing person and knows a lot. He's a great speaker, which I know you'll find out in a few minutes. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about some property that's very close to us, one that we see frequently if you go to Mount Pisgah, particularly the north section. There's that fenced off area and all those keep out signs. That used to be the Nature Conservancy property. It was recently acquired by the McKenzie River Trust. And so Joe's going to tell us a little bit about that and how that'll work. So without further ado, please give a nice warm welcome, Joe Moll.
How does the mic work? I'm using the lapel mic. Okay, in the back. I got dragged into the McKenzie River Trust 18 years ago. Which is just stunning to think about how fortunate I and my family have been to have had the opportunity to be here. On just a second. I do want to encourage you to come next week, next month to Magnus's presentation. I'm not going to wow you with, pull this down a little bit, get a little feedback. I'm not going to wow you with a tremendous slideshow.
My speakers.
Is that a little better? More difficult? What's it like in the back, Charlie? You can't hear now. Okay. We'll get there. Oh. How's that? Still not? A little higher? That's better if I talk that way? Okay. And thanks to all of you on the screen. I do have a few of Kit Larson's photos in here, so there's some nice ones, but when it comes to photos and such, you have the C Squad tonight. I really want to engage you in a conversation about three things. And I title Nature and People in the 21st Century. It's about love, about disturbance, and about restraint. Because I think the McKenzie, the transfer of the Willamette Confluence Preserve from the Nature Conservancy to the McKenzie River Trust is coming already with a lot of public expectations for, great, now we get to take some of those no trespassing signs down and get in there and enjoy it. And we are now trying to wrap our arms around what that means. So I really am serious in wanting to hear your thoughts and questions and encouragement, not just tonight, but it's going to be years for us to sort of set a tone and a culture about the use of the place. So to do that, I do want to go back over some of the things that some of you, if you saw my presentations to the club over the last 5-7 years, just to revisit, because we've learned so much in the 20 years now that the McKenzie River Trust has owned Green Island, which is what you're looking at here, about confluences of rivers, confluences of interest. And I think that the Willamette Confluence Preserve is just, in some ways, tabula rasa to really meld those things together. So let's go. 18 years at the McKenzie River Trust has affected my eyesight. So let's see if I can. I recognize so many of you. For those of you that aren't perhaps familiar with McKenzie River Trust, it has been around since 1989. We are a land trust, which means that we are one of about 1,500 organizations across the country that is focused on land that has public value. And it can be everything from one particular park and a land trust that is managing that place to something like the Nature Conservancy, which takes these tools and this approach all over the world and says, as apolitically as possible, this is important because this place provides clean water, fish and wildlife habitat, recreation value, the backdrop to the city. And so land trusts like the McKenzie River Trust are people who come for that common purpose, common good. We've grown tremendously. When I arrived in 2005, we had essentially 2 staff. We now have 15, we'll probably be at 18 by the end of this year. And we have expanded well beyond the McKenzie, where we are now working throughout the upper Willamette Basin, as well as on the coast. We have a staff member now based in Newport on the Central Coast. And we're looking and participating in projects from Lincoln City all the way down to Reedsport. So we'll set aside. Did people hear that Portland Audubon is notified that they're dropping the Audubon name? I saw that today. We have for years been asked, when is McKenzie River Trust going to change its name? And we so far still aren't, but if you have ideas, we're always looking. Those of you that heard my presentation or saw my presentation about my work in Hokkaido, Japan, saw this photo. This is probably turn of the 20th century. This is a photo of at least 4 members of the native people of Hokkaido, which is the northernmost large island of Japan, about the same latitude as we're on. These people are known as the Ainu, similar to what was happening in the American West at the time, and including with advisors from everyone from Secretary of Agriculture Horace Capron was in Japan, advising the Japanese government on modern development, and that included dispossessing land of people like the Ainu, just as it happened here and we're reckoning with today. But what I want to remind you was the conversation we had about the closeness to nature that was just much more natural for all people at some point in the past. But for Native peoples like the Ainu, up until 100, 150 years ago, what you see in the foreground is a brown bear. That's what I did my work on there. And the Ainu had a cosmology, a way of thinking about things that said all of the critters, all of the plants, animals that we rely on, they are beings in another realm, and they take on a costume so that we can recognize them. So the bear was known as the master king of the mountains, Nun Kamui. And they would have a feast when they took a bear. And then the last thing they would do, they would have a feast and the bear was in the seat of honor. The last thing they would do was peel the hide back from the skull, and that would release that being to go back to its realm and tell its friends what wonderful people the Ainu were. And so they had this completely inseparable sense of what it means to have reciprocity, to use a term that Robin Kimmerer has popularized, and just what it means to have a closeness with nature. Many of us have that in our own ways, but it's very difficult in the settings that we now live to live this way. And so that tension between how do we hold on to that, how do we practice that and continue to enjoy what we have enjoyed by doing what we do. When we look at questions of love and restraint, when it comes to where we are now in fish and wildlife conservation and land and water conservation, part of the problem we have now is that fish like these, like a Chinook salmon there on the top and an Oregon chub on the bottom, are pushed to the brink. They're on the edge. They're listed as endangered species. The numbers aren't there as much. So being able to think about our impact on them is much higher stakes now, because we know we've sent some species over the edge. They are extinct. Big responsibility. And so it's one of the things that when we get to discussing the Willamette Confluence Preserve, we'll have to think about. Because if you're in a world where bears are plentiful and you're harvesting bears periodically and working with them, the impacts of that disturbance that you're causing they're manageable by those populations. Now we're in a situation where that's no longer the case. And a lot of the work that we've been doing at confluences of rivers and elsewhere is trying to address that. Again, just to remind, this is the 1964 flood close to Salem, but this is what the Willamette Valley used to be like this time of year, actually springtime with snow melt and those sorts of things. Very dynamic system, great changes. And of course, with settlement, what we did was put dams in the headwaters over the last 80 years to tamp down those risks. And then we came in and have built in those places that were productive. As a result, this is 1854 on the screen left, 1967 on the right, and it's just a mapping of the complexity and the loss of complexity in that whole Willamette system. The arrow at the very bottom is the rough confluence with the McKenzie. So this is looking downstream of the Willamette from where we are today. And you've seen this before, I think. It's just much simpler. In order for us to create the lives we have, we've greatly simplified the system. And we've come and we've built these wonderful communities in Springfield and Eugene, right up against the edges of the rivers, which we love, and we've parks and we have all sorts of recreation and productivity and those sorts of things. And we've reached a point where we now recognize that our impacts on these places that we love are real. That is literally carrying our lives downstream in the water. So what do we do about that? We love rivers because they provided us gravel. This is the confluence of the McKenzie and the Willamette, and that is historically where Springfield and Eugene has gotten the bulk of its gravel that pave our roads and our sidewalks and our houses and all of the good that has come of that. It's where our wastewater goes. And I was just in Europe about a month ago and traveling around in a van that had a tiny little toilet with a tiny little waste container. And you only have to do that for a few days to actually start thinking a lot more actively about your own personal waste. But rivers they've provided us tremendous benefits and allowed us to expand and again, become the productive communities that we have today. There we go. We won't get into this tonight, but this is something, what the Lieber Dam system and the canal and the change is coming, but undeniably, we live incredibly comfortable, healthy, low-risk lives relative to 100 years ago because we've harnessed power. We are also the generation that is now fully aware of what the impacts of that have been, not just locally, but globally, and we're reckoning with that as well. So we have these wonderful love, ouch relationships with rivers and with land and water. So back to Green Island, the McKenzie River Trust was able to acquire Green Island in 2003 after years of work by a number of people, many of whom are still in the community today, leading other efforts, working with the trust, working with other organizations. Because what was recognized at the time was that confluences of rivers are ecologically extremely rich. And as you dig in deeper, many of the assumptions are that, just pause by saying, if you look at the literature, there's pretty good literature on it, but there's still a lot of assumptions. It's by association. We find greater diversity of fishes in some of these areas. The assumption is because of disturbance, that year to year, a confluence area especially, is wagging back and forth, and that what's water one year is going to be gravel the next year. And because it's gravel, wet gravel is going to allow cottonwoods to grow and expand. And so year to year, that shifting dynamic allows for all sorts of different niches, all sorts of habitat niches, which allows for speciation and species richness and all those sorts of things. It's the kind of thing, again, that back to that earlier slide, we've lost quite a bit in the Willamette Valley. So where we have Green Island, where we had a chance to work with land that had been farmed for about 100 years and give it back to the river. And it's been a wonderful place to learn. One of the best things we've learned is the river works on its own times and on its own terms. So we may think it's going to do one thing, and we may spend some money to remove some weeds off of an area and feel really good about it. And the river might completely blow that area out the next year, which is what happened to us in 2006, 2007. We're at a point now in the Willamette Basin where the number of native fish and the number of non-native fish that have established themselves are about equal. So a real, I don't know, poignant point, I guess. I was going to say tipping point. It's not necessarily a tipping point. But the simplicity, the warming of the river has allowed things like largemouth bass and bluegill, which are at home where I grew up in Kentucky, to now establish throughout the Willamette system, even up into the McKenzie. As a result of this and other things, Chinook, native salmon, cutthroat trout, others are taking it on the chin, so to speak. So that dynamism has been. And here is another lesson that we learned, that river is fine going around corners, but it also likes to cut through at times. And it's that you're looking in an area where, as you can see, there was a big bend in the river, it now cut through. And those of you that have been to Green Island or to the Willamette Confluence, you can see evidence of this from year to year. That dynamism is something that's, from an ecological standpoint, from a beauty standpoint, it's fantastic. From a, hey, we're living here, yikes, this is coming closer to my house. That's a really tough thing for us to deal with. Well, with climate change, dams or no dams, it's very likely we're going to have 1964 or 1947 or worse style floods regardless. And so what we do in these zones near our community has real impact on what kind of damage people might experience next year, 10 years, 100 years from now. Places like Green Island, the Willamette Confluence give us a chance to think about that and practice it on the ground. That's why I'm particularly so excited about it. Again, this is one of those areas. This was the river a couple years before this, maybe 5 years before this, abandoned except seasonally, but you see the incredible flush of growth. This isn't anything that was planted by humans. This just came in with the floods and grew. So it's that dynamism again that we seek. I'll quickly go upriver to Finn Rock, which many of you would have seen over the last couple of years, because we have, again, it's just a reminder of what we're what we're seeing, what we're learning. This is the South Fork of the McKenzie River coming in off the right side. That's the main stem McKenzie River coming in parallel. What you see on the right is post-restoration pre-fire, where the intent was to broaden the floodplain, get water into a broader number of areas, put a lot more complexity into it with wood, as it would have been 150 years ago, assuming that that will provide not only more spawning habitat, but more rearing habitat for fish and wildlife. In fact, that is what they're finding, that it did really both work and it helped temper some of the impacts of the fire. So for us at Finn Rock, this is looking upriver, almost at the top of the screen, there's a little open area, that's the McKenzie School, just for reference. Ponds in the upper right are the upstream ponds of Finn Rock itself. This was prior to the restoration project in 2021, but you can see post-fire. That's after. So here too, these are areas that we have dug with heavy equipment, added logs to it, brought in more complexity, slowed the water down, given the floodplain back some of that connection to the river. Another before, this coming just a little bit further downstream. That's before, after the fire, before restoration, and after restoration. So we are being very manipulative in these restoration projects here and with what the Nature Conservancy has done to date already at the Willamette Confluence to try to reset things a little bit, both to give the river access to the floodplain, but also to accelerate some of that dynamism. We'll be doing another project. We'll be doing phase 2 of this restoration project at Finn Rock Reach this summer. As well. So you'll see a similar level of disturbance. And then hopefully in the fall, this fall 2023 is the 5-year mark since the big restoration project at the South Fork of the McKenzie. 5 years is roughly when Chinook salmon are coming back. So there are fingers crossed for a really big return of salmon that will at least coincidentally look like the restoration project was a huge success. I mean, it's much more complex than that, but we're starting to get enough time to begin to see whether or not some of these things we are doing are having the impacts that we think they are. So all of that is background in some ways to this place, the Willamette Confluence Preserve. I've zoomed way out with this because, again, more than introducing you to the beauty of the preserve itself, I want to have this conversation about where this sits in our community and what we want to do with it, how we will roll with the changes that will come and what sort of changes we might bring about as because of it as well. It's not, everything in green is public land. So the green on the lower right is Howard Buford Park, the county park. Big, beautiful, wonderful recreation area that we have. Further downstream and to the left, it's hard to read, but that's Glass Bar Island. Some of you may have experienced it as Nudie Beach. Turtle Flats is a small parcel that the Friends of Buford Park in Mount Pisgah acquired. It was where Bring used to be, back behind that, so it abuts that area. To the north then is Doris Ranch, the big square. Come back in this direction, you'll see something that says Georgia Pacific Natural Area. That is managed, owned and managed, owned I think by Springfield, managed by Willamette Parks and Recreation District. On that side of the Middle Fork is the Middle Fork Trail. Then you can see clearly the bulk of the community of Springfield in the upper right. There's I-5 on the far left. So all of that area in the center that has pink roads and is surrounded by a thin yellow line, that's the roughly 1,300 or so acres of the Willamette Confluence Preserve. This is where the Wildish Company got one of its biggest starts. The Wildish Company, Wildish family, pulled gravel out of here as they did down at the Willamette Confluence and continue to for a period of time. Didn't go as deep as the gravel pits that are at the confluence of the McKenzie and the Willamette. Those pits can go as deep as 100 to 125 feet in some places. I think the Willamette Confluence Preserve pits may have been 25 or so. Charlie, do you know, is that right? I'm getting a head shake from Charlie Quinn. So that made restoration work that the Nature Conservancy was able to do much more feasible. Trying to do restoration work with a 120-foot deep pit next to a river is a really dangerous, difficult, expensive thing to do. Very unlikely that we will ever be able to do something like that at the current confluence of the McKenzie and the Willamette, because the pits are just too deep. Doesn't mean that the river's not going to find them and work their way into that, which could be a real interesting situation. But there's 1,300 acres. This isn't topographic. Everything sort of to the left side is floodplain, more or less. Everything sort of to the right side is a mix of floodplain, and then the slopes that come up into the park, into Howard Buford Recreation Area. And those of you that frequent the park and walk the backside, will, if you are careful as you're walking, every once in a while you can look it over and there'll be one of those little Nature Conservancy signs. The signs haven't changed yet, as far as I know. I don't think, certainly not deep in that forest. But it's this incredible mix of floodplain land and forest land. And it abuts a recreation area, and it abuts almost abuts an interstate. It abuts an agricultural area. It includes two rivers, the Coast Fork Willamette coming in from the bottom kind of narrowly and turning left, and the Middle Fork, the Willamette, which is a little more wavy there on the top. Their confluence is just downstream of this property, thus the Willamette Confluence Preserve. It's an incredible opportunity, incredibly complex place. It's unrecognizable already from what it looked like when the Nature Conservancy acquired it in 2010. So what happened is the Wallish family said, you know, we're ready to do something with this, and we kind of like to see it go into nature parkland, something like this. Came to a group in the community. Faye Stewart was a commissioner who brought it to our attention. We talked with the Wildish family. It became a bigger conversation. It was determined that the Nature Conservancy was in best position to negotiate that deal. They did, and were able to acquire it with a big slug of money from the Bonneville Power Administration, so your ratepayer dollars, and from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, state money that comes partly from the lottery, partly from some federal sources that go through the state. So it was acquired with one purpose in mind: fish and wildlife habitat. And within a year of its acquisition, the Corps of Engineers and the NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA Fisheries, and the Corps of Engineers sent out a memo saying, hey, we hear there's all this talk about maybe putting in some trails and maybe bridges and those sorts of things, and we want to say, no, that's for habitat. So don't even think about it. And it came out of the blue. It really was not anticipated. So from the beginning, this has been called out as, remember, this is for fish and wildlife habitat. This is for nature. This is not a playground, is the assumption. That was 2010. There's a lot that's happened between 2010 and 2023 when it comes to us thinking about community and nature and community and how we live together and who has access to things and who doesn't, and who do we invite in and who do we not, and how easy do we make it and how don't we? So Eli Tome came on staff about a little over a year ago as our director of conservation, and he introduced this idea. It's just really messy. Things are really messy, and I think it's true, but it's not like, oh, it's messy, let's back off. This is messy. This is why we got into this work, because we understand and care about bringing people and nature together, knowing that it can be really difficult sometimes, but with incredible rewards. These last really nice photos are from the Nature Conservancy. Some of the areas that, if you can move your mind in that direction, just imagine that this was a gravel pit, steep walled, bare rock, not much growing at all. This previous slide too, river on the left, steep walled, very well defined gravel pits on the right. Already, after 7 years, I guess, since the restoration work has been done, natural processes, ebb and flow of high and low water, some planting, but just a lot of natural revegetation that's occurring, and things are starting to soften up, really starting to soften up. So come back here again and think about the potential here. Just imagine that, and maybe some of you are serving in public office with the city of Springfield or the city of Eugene. Or maybe you're doing transportation planning and you're trying to think of how hard it is for somebody to get out to Howard Buford Park by bicycle and how dangerous it is. And you think, and with what we have there on the north side with the Middle Fork path, gosh, wouldn't it be really fun to have a bridge that went off into the park so that families in Springfield could just easily go into and across and enjoy that? Tempting, right? And we're not going to dismiss that long term. I think we need to keep those sorts of visions and think of all of the different uses that not only we and others can have of these places, because we want people to love them. I think I'm often asked, what's the biggest threat that you are trying to work against in land and water conservation? And I stick with the one, which is apathy. The biggest threat is for so many of us, we don't really have to think about this very often. There's so many great ways to live a life, diverted by my phone and anything else. But if we can't keep people's attention on these places and help each other develop and express love for these places, we're going to lose them because attention and money and capital is going to go elsewhere. So that's getting close to the fundamental challenge. How do we love these places and yet recognize that we have to restrain ourselves? If not only because there are legal restrictions that say this has to be for nature, this has to be for land and water, but because I know I've got an impact, right? What is my impact? Let's think about that a little bit. I should have brought this slide up. This is the end, the current terminus of the Middle Fork path, looking upriver. Again, an old pond there on the right. Do people frequent the Middle Fork path? It's one of my favorite areas in this community, which I just think it's an incredible resource. And just as a side note, there's only 3 or 4 properties as you go upstream between where we are there and the Jasper, what's that called? The Jasper Highway, that road that leads from Springfield to Jasper. And you cross that and you're at Willamette Lane's park on the other side. So I think I've got another picture of that connection of rivers to ridges, but the prospect of having these areas connected by walkways, bike paths, safer places, all up into Thurston Hills is very strong now and something that we'll continue to look at and work on. We love the river in many different ways. We love to be out in boats. We love to fish it. We love to just sit by it. These people aren't disturbing anything, right? They're not causing any problems, right? How about these people? These people were a part of a group that went out and gathered plants in a protected area because they wanted to make beer. Great way to get people to connect to the land, connect with the land in this community. Yeah, gather a few plants, and now with what we're learning about traditional cultures, whether they be in Hokkaido, Japan, or here in what we now call Oregon, and that reciprocity, knowing plants' lives, participating in that. We're really starting to think more about it. But there's no question that we have impacts on land. And I think what happens is we often think that immediately that it goes to this, that people will just trash the place and they'll be overrun and they'll be out there in the mud and it'll be like Woodstock that maybe some of you attended and it'll just be a big mess. And for us, when we were preparing to take over ownership of the trust, there was a pretty heightened level of concern, even in some of the first discussions at the staff and the board level. Like, wow, we want to take that on. It's just going to get overrun with people. Do we really want to manage people? And it's interesting, we go to this very quickly. This just happens to be a month ago, the World Championships of Cyclocross in Southern Netherlands, where I was. And this was a field that got really muddy, but this was 50,000 people over 3 days. But we go there quickly. And when we started to look at and did a little work with volunteers the summer before last, out at the Willamette Confluence Preserve, where there are all these trespassers, and started to count it, it's not that many. Some of you were out there and we'll talk to you later about that, but it's really not that many people. Could it become? Absolutely. Could 1 or 2 people cause real problems? fire, other sorts of risks? Absolutely. But part of what we need to do, we recognize, is try to tamp down our assumptions about what we know about place and how people will behave out there. And then think about how can we help each other think about restraining ourselves and behaving in a way that keeps these values that we all love. Recognizing that nature needs some level of disturbance, quote unquote, through floods and other sorts of things to thrive, but also then restraining ourselves and saying, I love the river, I love that place, but I'm not going to go this year or this week, maybe this time of season. You, as often birding-oriented folks, probably think a fair bit about disturbance, and you recognize behaviors in birds and maybe some species that are more or less tolerant of human presence. And there's no question that all of us, all wildlife at some level, can habituate to a certain level of human presence. It varies. But even that, we have assumptions that are probably too strong for our own good. There are certainly times of year when our presence is going to affect the success of reproduction, for example, the success of a population. And those are the wonderfully beautiful times of year that we like to be in these areas. There's a graduate student a couple of years ago, and I can't remember her name. Neil, you might remember. She did a study of floristics, the timing of blooms, weeds, other sorts of considerations in the management of the Willamette Confluence Preserve to say, maybe if we avoid some of these areas in this time of year completely, that it's no trespassing this time of year, but once flowering or breeding has been completed. So maybe timing of things. It's not something that we do a lot here. When I worked in Montana with grizzly bears there, you couldn't go into the national forest in some of these areas between April and July, because that's when grizzly bears were out and about and they wanted to give them. So there were seasonal closures. Maybe we'll have something like that. These are Kit, if you're still online, thank you for these photos. And Dennis and company, thank you for these bird boxes. For those of you that haven't seen that, these are also from Green Island. But again, the fact that we can be in an area, we can observe this, we start to think regularly that, okay, they're used to us, we're not having an impact on them. Maybe not. And we need to really be cognizant of that and be honest with ourselves and continue to study and learn as best we can and adapt. For some time, we had a red-winged blackbird that doesn't seem to be bothered and is more aggressive. But, I think these are some of our biggest challenges is, we know that we're not bothering them. They're bothering me. It's reminding me of a creature from the Black Lagoon. And we have these, we have our own rhetoric about how the world works, especially our relationship with the natural world. And it's something that we really do need to stop and be with ourselves and sit with it. And that's what I feel like the Willamette Confluence Preserve provides us, because it's a place to do this for 250,000 people, very close. There was some real excitement among Watershed Council partners when we were out there early on, and we went up to the ponds just across from the boat launch, more or less. So, door to door, if you went from a school slowly up there, maybe it's a slow 30-minute drive. And they were talking about the fact that their kids were at outdoor school 3 hours away, or going to something similar, driving 2 or 3 hours to have that kind of experience. And wouldn't it be great to provide that experience here? Can we do that and still maintain the ecological integrity, but still keep the critters, still keep nature first? How do we do that? Even this, the photographer, almost blends into the scenery. And me working with bears, this was one we had troubles with all of the time, as those of you that have been to places like Yellowstone or anywhere that are concentration of wildlife. We as photographers think, still, I can't see him. But there's an impact. There's definitely an impact. If this will work. What is that? This is at the Willamette Confluence. This is just across from the boat launch. And see, that's in the afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There was this great study in graduate school, study that was taught to us in graduate school about disturbance in expectations and what we see and what's actually happening. And they had captive deer, and these were deer that were habituated to humans because they were fed regularly or people walking through. And somebody had the brilliant, and so the assumption was, they just hang out and they kind of slowly move their heads left and right following them. We had the brilliant idea to equip them. So they put heart rate monitors and blood pressure monitors on them. Sure enough, when someone that they knew at a predictable time went through, visibly, no sign of disturbance. Internally, boom, off the charts. Blood pressure went up. They went on high alert. And so, again, when you're talking about a human community that is embedded like Native American people were, like our ancestors as Anglos were 1,000 years ago, like the Ainu. And the numbers were such that was just a part of things, and there were risks to us as well. It's one thing, but when we're dealing with communities, ecological communities that are on the edge of winking out either locally or globally, we have to be really careful when we come with our assumptions about what kind of impact we are or aren't having on them. So in that sense, we see the 1,300 plus acres as kind of a testing ground. What can we do to collectively learn and think about a culture that says, hey, up here, that's a park, it's a recreation area, and there are certain behaviors that are allowable and good, and we're going to say that is primarily for human recreation. But right next door, right here, just across this fence that's going to come down, we need to behave differently. Big questions, big lift, lots of really exciting things to do. It's going to be hard. So I really do look forward to, and that's maybe my, oh no, a few more slides. Again, we're thinking, I'm sorry, we tend to think of the big things, birds that we can see, elk, deer, bears, but it's even more difficult to think about, well, what are the impacts that we have on aquatic insects? What does our presence in these areas mean? My goodness, when I came to the McKenzie River Trust, these guys were this age. They're now all in college and beyond, my kids. And one of my sons is at Corvallis, working in a lab, he's a chemical engineering student. He's working in a lab on PFAS, forever chemicals that we're now starting to learn about. My goodness, what a load we have to think about. And so again, there are assumptions about how we love something, disturbance, and how can we restrain ourselves, I think is going to be critical, really going to be critical for the success of these sorts of places, not just the Willamette Confluence Preserve, but again, it's our backyard. We can really dig into it there. So that's what we're hoping to do. You got to have a Chinook salmon photo in there just so that the Chinook salmon folks in the crowd can, maybe that's just a reminder. Hey folks, this is serious and I need your help. Maybe that's what this adult Chinook salmon is saying. And again, back to what I said earlier, the apathy, my fear of how easy it is for us to not think about these sorts of things, to take them for granted. And conversely, how when people have the opportunity to participate in the care of a place, how their hearts swell, how they do become engaged, like all of you have in places like this. It happens, it does happen. So I do want us to explore opportunities to get people access to places in ways that we can care for them and develop that love as we're restraining ourselves. That sounds really complicated, doesn't it? This is what it's all about. I think I always end in this slide because it's so quick. These guys are now launched. They're on their own. They're taking over. They're making decisions, and whatever we can do to provide them and their peers and the young ones now the spaces to learn and the habits and the cultures, we need to do that. Thank you. For those of you on the Zoom, thank you. We only have my little computer mic, so hearing questions is not going to be easy. I asked, so I'll monitor the chat. So if you do want to ask a question, how much time do we have?
As much as you want.
What? Well, we'll be here for 2 more hours.
15 minutes.
Just kidding. If you have a question, we'll do some from here, but if you have a question online, just write it in the chat and I'll try to.
And questions from here, if one of us would repeat them for the people online so they can hear them. Okay. A question over here?
Yes.
So, you mentioned about this focus for fisheries and all that. So how many different, the whole raft of organizations for local and national for fishers, for hunters. And I wondered how they're involved in work out of travel to areas.
So the question, let me make sure I got it, is given our connection to the angling community, the fishing community, what sort of groups might be involved or are involved already in the work out here? Great question. Very little at this point, not because of reluctance on anybody's part. To their credit and to the challenge that they had, the Nature Conservancy did a marvelous job of converting a place over the course of 10 years from a big, extensive graveled area to a recognized natural area now. Part of that was a pretty tight closure on things and working directly with contractors and others. And so there hasn't been a great deal of outreach saying, hey, groups, come on and be a part of this. It's something that we have the opportunity to do now. But in the same way, having 50 or 100 volunteers, you have to think about, well, what's the impact? What's the net? I know that there's a lot of interest among angling groups, among different organizations that are involved, that are involved in that sort of work. So I think the potential is there, but currently we don't have anything going.
Jerry?
My hearing isn't perfect and I might have missed this, but the transfer of this property from Nature Conservancy to the trust, who initiated the conversation and why?
Thank you. No, your hearing's great. I didn't say anything about that at all. So Jerry's question was, who initiated the discussion about the transfer from the Nature Conservancy to the McKenzie River Trust, when and why? When the Nature Conservancy acquired the property in 2010, they were very clear. They said, we'll do the transaction. We will find the money. We will work on the restoration, the initial restoration. The Bonneville Power Administration, or Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, all of the alphabet soup acronyms, said, we don't want to just get it bought. We want to see it restored. The Nature Conservancy said, we'll do the transaction, we'll do the restoration, but we will not hold it long-term. That is not in our strategic plan at that time. So in about 10 years, we'll be looking for another group. At that time, in previous 10 years to that, what just happened about a month ago, again, there's been this cycle of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service saying, hey, we need authority and there's going to be money to expand fish and wildlife boundaries, fish and wildlife refuge boundaries. So there was some thought that the Fish and Wildlife Service would actually take it on. Maybe Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, maybe state parks. So there was this assumption. The question of, could it become somehow associated with Lane County parks? All that was put together. Fast forward to 2020, when the Nature Conservancy said, okay, 10 years is up. We want to start the process. They sort of reached out and said, who's available, who's interested? And at that time, the big agencies, we've entered a period where we went through a period where particularly federal agencies, but state agencies as well, were either very reluctant or unable from a funding standpoint to take on new properties. So there was a conversation about Friends of Beaufort Park and Lane County doing something. And there was a conversation about us taking it on, McKenzie River Trust taking it on. There was a process. We put in a proposal, described how we would manage it long-term, and were selected that way. And it was a transfer. We didn't pay the Nature Conservancy for this. When they acquired the property, they were given some stewardship dollars as well. They used up some of those and they transferred those, the remaining funds to us. That ends up being about $1 million. If we look long-term at a property like this, at how much it costs just to manage every year, and think about, well, if you could endow that somehow, that's how we tend to look at things. What will it take to manage long-term? it's about a $3 to $7 million endowment that you would need. So we got $1 million. We're going to be working to raise more money, particularly through people's estates. Estate plans are a great way for long-term legacy giving. So we'll have more to say about that in the coming months and years. That's the background. So good, important to know. So thank you. We have a question here. I'm not seeing any questions on the chat, so still in. Roger?
Joe, in the early years of the trust ownership, Green Island, we were really reluctant to let people onto the land. And that gradually evolved with the trust meeting, field trips, and then having a Green Island day once a year, to now where once a month we allow the public to visit the island. Do you see that as a possible model for the confluence?
So the Nature Conservancy was, oh, thank you. We were observed, Roger Robb, who was with the McKenzie River Trust and for a long time, observed that initially when the trust acquired Green Island, we similarly didn't really bring people in very often, but things evolved where we started to lead guided tours. And then we started to have an annual celebration that brought hundreds of people out. And that has now shifted to our second Saturday Explore Green Island days, where the gates are kind of open and people can explore. Is something like that possible at Willamette Confluence Preserve? Absolutely, and already in motion. The Nature Conservancy had already done periodic tours. The McKenzie River Trust is picking those up. One of the things that's distinct is given the road access, the controlled road access, it's a very good place for the city of Eugene and Willamette to bring in small activity buses for people with limited mobility. So there have already been a number of limited mobility tours, and there will continue to be. The current management plan for the Willamette Confluence Preserve, which has been blessed, okayed by Bonneville Power Administration and OWEB, recognizes that, yeah, there are gravel roads out there and there can continue to be use. Some of them they need to maintain because BPA has power lines that go through the property and through the park. So there will always be some level of infrastructure. And they're looking to us to update the management plan with some sidebars. What's the next 5 or 10 years going to look like? So one of the things that we'll be doing in the next 18 months is spending more time on the ground, probably with volunteers, helping think about, are there some areas where we should simply say, this is a no entry area, this is the holiest of holies? Are there other areas like the pond that's only a couple hundred yards away from the greenhouses that the Friends of Beaufort Park maintain, where maybe a simple walking trail in there with some blinds around those ponds would be an easy way to steer people to an area and let them come and go. As an aside, when I lived in Japan and I was in my 20s and wanted to go all over the place in the wild, I was just really frustrated because there were huge buses. You've seen it, huge busloads of people. They'll go to a scenic site, they'll take their pictures, they'll do things for 15 minutes, and then they'll go back to the hotel and party. And that would just, oh, how can you love nature that way? But in a country with the kind of population density that Japan had, I began to see that, wow, those really well-coordinated, accessible sites have a great function because people do have connection, but you don't have the impact like that picture from the cycling video. And so the next 18 months, we'll be looking at, all right, where are some sidebars and where are there opportunities? Again, can it be seasonal? For now, for this coming year, it will continue to be by tour invitation only, and those things are starting to roll out now. But in the future, I think there is good opportunity. I think even the agencies themselves are recognizing, they're seeing the success of volunteer programs as a relatively lower cost stewardship alternative to lands. And they are also feeling both the joy of support for agency programs that protect areas that have some access, as well as the apathy issue that, people don't care about this, support for our budget, support for this work declines. So I'm hopeful, forever hopeful.
David?
Yeah, Joe. Green Island the river is coming through and as it wants to. Do you foresee that happening at the Willamette Confluence? And is that something that EPA is and the other agencies are going to not want to happen? Can you talk about some of those?
David has observed that at Green Island, as I pointed out, the river has taken its own course and really shifted some things. And thankfully, it hasn't affected any really critical infrastructure out there. And as I propose, we're going to see floods, what's going to happen? Great, complicated, interesting question. So just upstream on the Middle Fork, you've got a dam, right? Not too far up till you get to a smaller check dam and then the bigger dams up above. So our sense is that it's safe and controlled. Again, given the change in the periodicity of rainfall and snowmelt, we're going to have some wild cards. So we're going to see big floods. And even when the river broke through at Green Island and between the winter of 2006-07, I think it wasn't a big flood year, but it was a high water year where things were saturated for a long time. And the river had been working at an area that was just not as direct to the ocean. And it finally wore through. In 1996, on the far side, almost off the page here, again, the yellow boundary there. So Middle Fork coming right to left. The river started to eat to the south. And the Wildish Company put in 7 barbs over the course of about 1/8 of a mile, maybe, to deflect that flow, kick it back to the north and reduce that erosion. It worked. The river's coming behind them. And so the ponds that are in the upper most area right across from Clearwater Park, I showed that long one. It is very possible that in the future, at some point, the river could cut back into that floodplain and cut into those ponds, and that could become the main stem. And it's going to come down and hit some hard rock of Mount Pisgah itself and deflect north again. But it could really change the wiggle right around Clearwater Park. And early on, before we even own it, I met with Lamelane folks and sub folks to say, this is happening. It's likely that we're going to take over. We're not going to be in a position to put in barbs. It's not what we're about. It's not going to be allowed as a natural area. And so the consequences of the river potentially shifting away from Clearwater Park, where the takeoff for the mill race is, and there are complicatedly a couple of water rights associated with the mill race downstream, but it's just a big, wonderful environmental amenity now, in part because we're actively deflecting flow into it. The river could shift away from that. More importantly, perhaps more impactfully, downstream a little farther, the Springfield Utility Board has its well field for a good portion of its water system. And the river could similarly deflect a little bit south away from the 2 pipes that it has in the Middle Fork to draw water directly into the system and to draw water that they put onto that well field to saturate the wells. Engineering wise, you can solve that. If the river shifts, you can extend pipe. Water law perspective, that's really hairy. It's not easy to change the point of diversion, even in the case of an emergency. So these are the kind of things that's right there in this space that, hey, we want to love this place. We want to give the river space to roam and move, but we have to recognize that it might kick us in the shins, and we need to plan ahead for that sort of thing. The Coast Fork on the other side, going through a lot of agricultural lands, not nearly as much infrastructure currently, and we will be working with the agricultural community and other community members to try to keep it that way, so that if the river does shift, the consequences aren't so great. And similarly to what has happened on the main stem Willamette in and around Green Island, give people incentives to continue to farm, live, work there as we can, but understand the river's going to move and come in, and how do we grapple with that long term? It's really dynamic area.
And it's across from Green Island County on Isleman. Isn't that what happened there? The river kind of moved away from the boat landing.
Yep.
Anything over there worth being involved with? Is starting that up with that part? Been closed as long as I can, or not closed, but.
Well,
access.
so the question was around what happened at Green Island, where similarly a shift in the river channel pulled away, I think from Whiteley Landing was one of the impacts, and then as well at Hylaman Landing. Green Island, actually, the ownership maps, the McKenzie River Trust owns some property on that side, so it's adjacent to the park. So actually, 4 years ago, we worked with the county to clean up. There used to be an old, the remains of a concrete toilet that was a nuisance attractant. There have been a number of plans to try and improve the condition of the place and think about access in some of these areas as well. The University of Oregon's landscape architecture group, the students did some classes out there coming up with different alternatives. So there are some things quietly going on. I think the success of Lane County's Parks Bond last year will really start to show in the coming years, but being able to take advantage of opportunities like that. But those are exactly the kind of things that will happen as long as we live close to rivers, and the consequences of us loving rivers by building up against them and putting more infrastructure adjacent to them, they're going to come later when we do have those sorts of flood events or just shifts.
Where's the parking lot on the back?
Let's see, in this photograph, the question was, where's the parking lot on the backside of Mount Pisgah? It is just off the map in the lower right corner. So it's not on what you're seeing. You see how the green extends all the way to the south. So the east parking lot, it's down there.
Okay, I have to get up early tomorrow morning. I forgot.
Birders.
So
I'm happy to stay. I'll put my
Maybe,
mask back on for folks that would like to chat some more. I've got time.
So
Thank you all. I recognize many of you as supporters. I don't care if you're supporting the trust alone, or you're supporting the Audubon Society or the McKenzie Watershed Council or St. Vinny's or anything. I mean, just engagement in the community. And I think I've said this to this group before. My professional goal, which I won't quite reach, is to have groups and work like this not be considered environmental work, but to really be considered community work, community development work, inseparable from how we think about how we live. And your support and participation in that is what makes it possible. So really do thank you for that.